Okay, good. Yeah, thank you. I don't want to take much time and start with an introduction by Leanne, who will just give us the content introduction. Leanne, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Conrad. Good morning, everyone. I'm Leanne Jackson. I'm the head of the Agro-Food Trade and Markets Division at the OECD, which is the division that was responsible for producing this report that we'll be discussing this morning. So it's really a pleasure to be with you today to discuss this topic. It's a little bit of a different audience for us, so we're really looking forward to the discussion. So some years ago, we started seeing alarming headlines about food systems, that they were broken and that they needed radical reform. And this catalyzed lots of discussions on food systems, and those discussions have intensified this year in the lead up to the UN Food Systems Summit. So in this report, recent report that was produced by my team, we're digging into questions about food systems and how to make policies for better food systems. My colleague Koen will present the details of the report. So before I pass it over to him, I just wanted to share a few thoughts about the work that we've been doing at the OECD that relates to food systems. And then I'll focus on the past, the present, and then a little bit on the future. So in terms of our past work, our work related to food systems spans decades. The second point of our current work, our report is highlighting the need to pay attention to the process, not just to admiring the problems. And the third point is in the work that we're doing in the future, we're going to be digging into questions around what kind of data and evidence do we need to mobilize to make better policies for food systems. So if I can say just a few more details about the work we've done over the past decades, we've covered topics ranging from monitoring support to agriculture to modeling the medium-term outlook for agricultural commodity markets. And we've also developed insights on risk management and resilience, as well as some insights on agricultural productivity and innovation. We've been collecting facts in this area for quite a long time. So for over 30 years, we've shown how government support to agriculture distorts markets, harms the environment, and actually is largely ineffective at improving livelihoods. But despite all the evidence that we've produced, our monitoring also shows that it's been hard to reform policies. Our monitoring report, for example, from 2020 shows that more than $700 billion were provided in annual agricultural support. And our review of fisheries, also from last year, highlighted that 1/3 of government support to fisheries lowers the cost of inputs like fuel, vessels, and gear, and this can encourage overfishing. So this leads me to my second point, which is the report that we're discussing today. Given that reform is hard to achieve, we are advocating for a shift in perspective to look at the how of food systems policies. So the report highlights evidence describing a complex challenge, and Koen will go into more details, but these are ensuring food security and nutrition, livelihoods for producers and other stakeholders all along the food chain, and doing everything goes in an environmentally sustainable way. But rather focusing just on the challenges, our analysis is also digging into the questions around why policy reform in agriculture and food can be so difficult. And we're advocating adopting the systems perspective, which means that in order to address these challenges in a coherent way, we're going to need better coordination and communication across all different parts of government and other parts of the food system. The report also gives some insights into the process of policy reform and points out that disagreements over facts, interests, and values can get in the way of necessary policy reforms. And Koen will get into that in a bit more detail. So finally, the third point I wanted to make is our future work. We're actively engaging with preparations for the UN Food Systems Summit, which means we're talking with scientific experts working in the action tracks. We're engaging with the Food Systems Summit Secretariat. And in all these interactions, we draw on the decades of evidence and analysis that the OECD has been producing on food systems topics. Our future research is going to look at questions around data and evidence, So for example, what does a systems approach mean for data and evidence? What should we be measuring? And can new technologies be used to collect data, and what's needed in terms of policies in order to ensure we can innovate in that area too? So if we want to make better policies for food systems, we need to get beyond the status quo.
Leanne, you are muted now.
Okay, I'm just wrapping up anyway. The message I'd like to leave you with is policy reform is possible, but it will require effort. And my colleague Kunda Koenig will highlight some of the insights from our report on how to navigate change in this complex area. So I'm really pleased to be here. I'm looking forward to all the insights from the panelists and the discussions that follow. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Leanne. I don't want to spend much more time. I hand over to de Koenig. He's the lead author of the report. He's an economist and policy analyst at OECD. Please, Con, I hand over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss with you our new report on food systems. Maybe a few words about myself. So as Conrad mentioned, I'm a policy analyst at the OECD in Leanne's team. I've been working in the OECD for about 4 years now. And previously, I worked on the OECD FAO Agricultural Outlook. And I'm also the lead author of the OECD report on concentration in seed markets after the Bayer-Monsanto merger. And before that, I did my PhD in economics with Jo Swinnen, who many of you will know. And I also worked for a while as a consultant in the private sector. We're very pleased that we have an opportunity to discuss with you about our latest work on making better policies for food systems. And my presentation here, I'll give a bit of an overview of what we did in that report. And myself, we are based in the Trade and Agriculture Directorates of the OECD, which means that we deal with global issues, but of course, inevitably, a lot of our insights and data are deeper when it comes to OECD and G20 countries, and our knowledge is not always as extensive for other parts of the world. So this is why we're very pleased that we have an opportunity to discuss and gather insights about how these things play out in other contexts. And we're also very happy to be joined today by Philip Heinrichs of the OECD Sahel and West Africa Club. They have recently done some interesting work on food systems in the Sahel and West Africa region, which is really complementary with our own work here. And it will be interesting, I think, as a complement to the message that I'll be bringing here today. So before I dive into the specifics of the report, maybe I'll just say a few words about the OECD, just to in case people are not very familiar with what we do. We are, of course, an international organization based in Paris. Sometimes described as a club of mostly rich countries, which is not completely wrong either. We have maybe only 37 member states, but they do account for a large part of the global economy. We have about 3,000 employees, which is mostly policy analysts like myself, working on issues, all social, economic, and environmental challenges. In a development context, you might be mostly familiar with the work of the Development Assistance Committee on collecting official development aid statistics, but we also work on tax evasion, education, food and agriculture, you name it. And how we work, we say that our goal is better policies for better lives. How do we do that? There's different ways. One is informing and advising. So we try to be a unique source of data analysis and insights for policymakers. The second channel is by engaging and influencing. We bring policymakers together so they can share their experiences and compare notes about what works and what doesn't work. And the third way of achieving better policies for better lives is in some areas the OECD itself sets standards or provides concrete support to policymakers. The OECD has been working on agriculture and food since the very beginning, and we have a wide range of work. I just wanted to highlight a few examples here. One, as I already mentioned, is our Agricultural Outlook, an annual publication joint with FAO. We also have an annual overview of agricultural policies around the world, which includes the calculation of how much support the sector receives every year. But we also do a lot of thematic work. For example, we have a large stream of work looking at innovation, productivity, and sustainability, where we're focusing on what kind of policy environment maximizes innovation and maximizes the benefits from innovation, and many other topics besides. On the development side, we also have work on development cooperation, on financing for sustainable development, on policy coherence for sustainable development, and many other topics. I especially mentioned the latter report because we've worked very closely with this team to shape our own thinking on policy coherence for food systems. So what exactly is in our report on making better policies for food systems? Well, as Leanne already mentioned, our starting point was that this is the very first report by the OECD that talks about food systems. It's a term that is increasingly used in policy debates, but OECD hadn't yet written a report on that, stating its vision on that. And as we started work on this, we noticed that a lot of the debates were very black and white. People were saying that food systems are broken or not broken. And that is not very helpful as a way of talking about food systems, because something is either broken or it isn't broken. It doesn't leave a lot of room for asking what can be improved, what is working well, and so on. So we thought it might be useful to take a little bit more of a nuanced view to find out what is really going on. So the three main questions or themes of our report are the first question is really, what is the performance of food systems? What are the challenges, but also what are the achievements? And what is the role of policies? The second set of questions deals with the complexity of food systems, because when we say food systems, we mean not just agriculture, we mean the linkages with the environment, with nutrition and public health, and so on. And inevitably, that can get very complicated. There are many possible interactions. So how do you navigate that complexity as a policymaker? How can you come up with coherent policies in such a complex system? And a third set of questions has to do with obstacles. What makes it so difficult to achieve better policies for food systems? And how can we overcome those obstacles? And this corresponds with the three core chapters of our report. In addition, our report also has 3 detailed case studies. One deals with the seeds sector, a second one looks at ruminant livestock, and a third one looks at processed food. And the idea here was to take a closer look at one input sector, one primary agricultural sector, and one downstream sector. And each time we chose some of the most controversial areas in food systems debates. And every chapter talks about those controversial issues, talks about those policy issues, and explains with different policy approaches that have been used. So let's take a look maybe first at the performance of food systems. And when we say performance, we of course first need to know what are we expecting from food systems. And people expect many different things from food systems. The list is very long, but I think most people would agree on 3 core outcomes. The first one obviously being food security and nutrition for a global population that is expected to be approaching 10 billion by the middle of the century. A second important outcome is livelihoods. Millions of people around the world depend on food systems for their income and for their livelihoods, not just the millions of farmers and fishermen, but also other people working in processing, manufacturing, retail, and so on. And third, we of course want environmental sustainability. In addition, as the COVID-19 crisis has made abundantly clear, it is important that we have resilience across these dimensions as well. And our first chapter talks about the evidence, how the food system has performed on these different dimensions. And our conclusion here is that things are not black or white. Food systems have had important achievements, but also have some serious shortcomings. And following on that point, we also argue that better policies can make a difference, and that in fact, a lot of existing work by the OECD and by other organizations has shown that there are many ways in which policies could be improved to improve the performance of food systems. So let's take a look first at one of the achievements of food systems. If we look at how the world has evolved since the 1960s, we'll see that the world population has more than doubled. At the same time, food production has almost quadrupled. And this is a major achievement, especially because in the 1960s and 1970s, this was not at all obvious. In the 1960s and 70s, informed analysts were worried that the world would not be able to keep up with growing population, and that people were predicting overpopulation and famine. So the fact that food production not only managed to keep up with strong growth in population, but even managed to increase faster than that, so increasing the availability of food per person at the global level, is a major achievement. At the same time, we also know, of course, that we are still very far from achieving healthy diets for all. There has been progress over time in reducing undernourishment, although unfortunately in recent years that progress seems to have gone in reverse. And at the moment, it seems that still hundreds of millions of people suffer from hunger and undernourishment. In addition, compared to the 1960s or 70s, we've also seen new public health problems emerge, notably overweight and obesity. And as this chart shows, this is not just a rich world problem. This is an issue that we see all over the planet. The rates of overweight and obesity are rising everywhere. So clearly some achievements and some major challenges as well. Let's take a look then at the environmental dimension. So food systems have a very large environmental footprint, and this happens in a number of areas. It's true for land use, for deforestation, for biodiversity loss, for water use, water pollution, and for global warming. And what is interesting here is that when we talk about the environmental footprint of food systems, most of the environmental damage happens at the agricultural production stage. So it happens either at the farm level or the stage just before, when forests are cleared, for example, to make way for farmland. And historically, that was the main way in which agricultural production was increased. But what is interesting is that since about the 1960s, there has been a decoupling. And so even though global food production quadrupled over that time period, global agricultural land use went up by about 10 or 15%. And it's tempting to say only 10 or 15%, but we have to keep in mind that we are still talking about an area roughly twice the size of Greenland. So we are still talking about an enormous area that has been converted from natural landscape into farmland, which has meant a serious negative effect on the environment. But still, it is clear that food systems in the last few decades have managed to dramatically increase the production of food per unit of land. And if that had not been possible, the consequences both for the natural environment and for food security would have been very negative. So how did food systems manage to increase the output of food per unit of land? Broadly speaking, there are two main ways in which you can do that. You can either use more inputs, more irrigation water, more fertilizer, more pesticides, and so on. Or you can try to use the existing inputs more efficiently, trying to get more outputs from the same amount of inputs. And between the 1960s and the 1990s, most of the growth in global agricultural output came from using more inputs. But since the 1990s, that story has changed. And since the 1990s, most of the growth in global food production comes from efficiency gains, from using the existing inputs more efficiently. And this is great news for the environment. At the same time, those efficiency gains have also led to lower food prices. And if we look at the long-run evolution of real prices for agricultural commodities, those prices have been falling over time. And this is great news for consumers, for the many billions of consumers around the world. But obviously, that same pattern of lower food prices is very challenging for farmers, especially for farmers who do not manage to increase their productivity. So looking across these different dimensions, the livelihoods aspect, the food security and nutrition aspect, the environmental sustainability aspect, we see that there are both important achievements, but also some major challenges. And those challenges require effective policy responses. Unfortunately, when we look at the landscape of policies around the world, we see that many agricultural policies are simply not effective at addressing this triple challenge, and in many cases are counterproductive. And here I'll be citing some of the numbers from our report on agricultural policy monitoring and evaluation, which I highlighted earlier. So it's an annual publication by the OECD that surveys agricultural policies in 54 countries. So this includes all of the OECD member states, as well as all other major agricultural producers. And what this report finds is that around the world, every year, the agricultural sector receives some $700 billion in support. And now I want to be very clear, this does not mean $700 billion in subsidies for farmers. That is part of it, but this $700 billion also includes things like the effects of protectionist trade policies, as well as the investments governments make in infrastructure or research and development for their agricultural sector. And that latter category of investments in R&D and in infrastructure, that is a very important category because this is exactly what we need to make food systems more productive, more sustainable, and more resilient. But unfortunately, that is only a very small part of the total. In fact, the vast majority of the 700 billion is spent to increase the income of individual agricultural producers. And there are many different ways in which you could do that, but unfortunately, governments are mostly using some of the most distorting measures. Those policy measures which are coupled to production. And those measures have many negative side effects. They stimulate overproduction, they stimulate the excessive use of inputs. They also reduce resilience because they actually lock farmers into certain specific activities. So in this particular case, we see that simply moving some of the policy effort away from those most distorting measures and towards less distorting measures or towards investments in research and development and infrastructure, these kinds of policy changes would go a long way to improving the performance of food systems. In this particular case, the policy implications are relatively clear, but that is not always the case. In general, food systems are highly complex, as this diagram shows. There are many interaction effects between many different areas of food systems. And if we want to make effective policies, we should try and get policy coherence. We should make sure that a policy in one area does not create negative spillover effects in another area. But given the complexity of food systems, how can you do that? It's easy for policymakers to feel overwhelmed. So the second chapter of our report asks the question, given this complexity of food systems, how can we develop coherent policies? And our basic philosophy is to try and make things as simple as possible, but not any simpler. So in that spirit, we derived some pragmatic principles for greater policy coherence. The first one is that when policymakers are thinking about a new policy initiative, they should be aware of possible synergies and trade-offs with other policy areas. And this may seem like a trivial point, but unfortunately, we know that historically, a lot of policy on food systems was made in silos without taking into account those broader effects. There's an important second point, though, which is a follow-up to the first point, and it is not enough to simply be aware of possible synergies and trade-offs. We actually need to go out and rigorously evaluate those interactions as well. Because just because some kind of interaction effect might exist does not mean that those effects are real or big enough to matter in a specific context. To give a specific example, some people have said that farm subsidies have contributed to obesity in rich countries. It turns out that in most OECD countries, agricultural policies are actually not lowering prices, but raising them through, for example, protectionist trade policies. So reforming agricultural policies would probably not have the positive synergy of also tackling the obesity crisis. So it is important that we rigorously think about these interactions and we don't just rely on intuition. We need to try and quantify these things as much as possible. The third point is that when we talk about synergies and trade-offs between different policy domains, sometimes we think about these things as if they are set in stone, as if there must be a tension between, for example, economic growth and the environment. In reality, it's more nuanced because these patterns of synergies and trade-offs actually depend on your choice of specific policy instruments. For example, if we are trying to increase the income of farmers by giving fertilizer subsidies, we are stimulating farmers to use more fertilizers, which in turn may have negative consequences for the environment. So with that specific policy instrument, a fertilizer subsidy, there is a tension between helping the farmer and helping the environment, but that is only because of the specific choice of policy instrument. And it's easy to see that if we would change this policy instrument and, for example, change it into paying farmers for ecosystem services, we could turn a trade-off into a synergy. So it's important to think about specific policy instruments and then try and change the way that these instruments are designed to maximize the synergies and minimize the unpleasant trade-offs. Now, when there are synergies, one thing we have noticed in discussions on food systems is that people often get carried away or get too enthusiastic about a potential instrument which has synergies or co-benefits. One example here is we know that shifting to healthier diets in high-income countries would probably also increase the environmental performance of food systems. At the same time, this may be true, there might be a co-benefit there, but that does not mean that shifting to healthier diets by itself will be sufficient to fix the environmental problems of food systems. So a single instrument, in this case, healthier diets, is not sufficient to meet all of our goals. We need to stop thinking about a silver bullet, the one instrument that can solve all the problems. And we have to start thinking in terms of a policy mix where a range of different approaches together get us where we have to be. And finally, a principle on trade-offs. There were, even when we've thought carefully about policy instruments that minimize unpleasant trade-offs, there will always be some trade-offs remaining. And how you resolve those trade-offs is not just a technical question. Of course, any decision here has to be based on the best possible technical analysis. But it is not a scientific question. There is always an element of societal choice, which involves value judgments, and different societies can end up making different choices. So we hope that these 5 principles go some way towards reducing the complexity of food systems and achieving greater policy coherence. At the same time, we also know that complexity is not the only reason why it has been difficult to reform policies for food systems. And in our 3rd chapter, we talk about these obstacles and how they can be overcome. One way of thinking about it, one way that we found quite useful, is that better policies are often made difficult by disagreements over facts, interests, and values. There is quite a bit we know about how food systems work, but there are also still important gaps in the data and in the evidence, not only about how big the problems are, but also about what causes the problems and which kinds of policy responses would be most effective under which circumstances. So there is still quite a bit that we need to improve our understanding about. In addition, in some cases, the evidence is quite clear, but there might be important gaps between public perception and the evidence. So the bottom line here is that it is essential that we create a shared understanding of the facts. And in our chapter, we offer several mechanisms that can be used to make sure that any kind of policy debate is based on the best possible evidence and creates a shared understanding of that evidence. Now, it is important that you get a shared understanding of the facts, but at the same time, the facts can only tell you how the world is. It doesn't tell you how the world should be. This is where interests and values come into play. Interests, of course, are important because any change in policy tends to create both winners and losers. And those groups will have an incentive to try and lobby the government to move the policy in their preferred direction. Now, by itself, this process of lobbying is not necessarily a bad one. It is actually useful for governments as a way to find out how a proposed initiative would affect different groups in society. Where things go wrong is if when certain groups have a privileged access to governments, or when some groups are not even heard at all in the policy process. So what is important is that we have a policy process that promotes transparency, accountability, and a level playing field to make sure that all stakeholders in society have an equal chance to be heard. And again, our chapter lists many OECD good practices that can help create such a policy process. But facts and interests are not the only elements that matter here. And facts and interests receive a lot of attention in debates on food systems, but there is a third component which we think is not discussed frequently enough, and that is the role of values. Many debates in food systems have a strong value component to them. I like to use the example of genetically modified organisms, which makes it especially striking. This is, if you look at it at first glance, it looks like a debate about the productivity effects, the health effects, and the environmental consequences of a new technology. So it looks like a debate around the facts. Potentially, some would say also a debate around interests. But when you dig a little bit deeper, you will see that a lot of the controversy on this issue has to do with values. Some people don't trust this technology because they don't trust large corporations. Some people are opposed to the technology because they see it as just a technological fix for deeper societal problems, or because they think it is simply unethical to be manipulating genetic material. So there is a lot of values or ethical aspects that come into play in understanding this policy controversy. These value differences pop up everywhere in food systems debates. And it is important to understand them for several reasons. And one of those reasons is that a difference over values is much harder to resolve than a difference over facts or interests. With a difference over facts, at least in theory, we can ask scientists to do more research to gather more evidence. When there's a disagreement over interests, at least in theory, we might be able to find a way that the winners can compensate the losers so that we can move ahead with the reform. But these approaches don't really work for values. Almost by definition, a value is something that you don't want to trade in for something else. So it's very hard to see how those approaches would work for values. What do you do when you're faced with a value difference? Well, ideally, you would think of a creative adjustment. Sometimes you can change a policy proposal so that it becomes acceptable to people with very different values. Unfortunately, that is not always possible, and sometimes society just has to make a difficult choice. And recent work by the OECD has explored the potential for deliberative processes to make progress in such difficult environments. And just yesterday, we had a great webinar where we explored this idea in more detail. A deliberative process takes, for example, 100 citizens chosen at random to be representative of society and lets them have facilitated discussions with experts and with themselves, and then make recommendations to the government. So this, in a nutshell, is our report on food systems. And you'll see that we spend a lot of time talking not just about the what of better policies, but also the how. How should the process look like to make better policies? And that is not a coincidence. We strongly believe that food systems are enormously complicated, but also very heterogeneous. There's a lot of local variation. So it's really difficult for policy analysts to come up with a set of recommendations that would be true for everybody, to come up with a one-size-fits-all policy prescription. every kind of policy for food systems has to be tailored to local circumstances. So it's important that there's a good process in place locally that can balance the facts, the interests, and the values. I want to finish by saying a few words about the UN Food Systems Summit. As you are probably all aware, in September there will be a UN Food Systems Summit, which is already proving to be a catalyst for discussions at the global, national, and subnational level. And the OECD is committed to contributing its expertise on food systems to that process. You'll see that we have a wide range of expertise on all areas related to food systems. So we've been engaging with the scientific group, and we're also involved in some of the action tracks. In addition, we've created a web page that you can see here, which brings together all of the relevant OECD work on food systems. Of course, if you have any other questions, please feel free to contact us at the email address shown here. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Koen. This was really quite a big nutshell. Yeah, our heads are full of very strong information. Thanks a lot. And of course, the main word to remember is complexity. We will try to clear it up a little bit. A question to Usman. Are you now in the room? Are you with us? You want to take over? Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, our moderator is still trying to get in. Usman, when you come in, please let me know. So I continue a little bit. We now have, before we go to the panel, we have one I would say maybe co-presenter, some small comments. Philip Heinrichs from OECD. He works for the OECD Sahel and West Africa unit, and he will reflect on the words of his colleague Koen. Philip, over to you. We can hear you. We cannot hear you yet.
Hello, good morning. Thank you very much, Conrad. Can you hear me now? Yes, I assume so. Okay, thank you very much. Indeed, I have been asked to present a couple of slides on how Koen's presentation and Tad's work on food systems globally translate into the African, or here in this case, into the West African context in particular, and what this means for the policy debate, for the policy synergies and trade-offs in the African context. Maybe a couple of words to myself before. I'm Philip Heinrichs. I'm head of unit at the Sahel and West Africa Club at the OECD. I'm leading our work on food system transformations. I've been with the OECD for the past 18 years. And before that, I worked for a brief period at the GIZ. So hello to the familiar names I'm reading in the participants list. The first slide is like who we are, the Sahel and West Africa Club, and I think it's relevant actually for the discussion. So the OECD Sahel and West Africa Club was founded in the 70s, and this as a response to the food crisis and droughts that devastated the Sahel regions at the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s. And the idea was to create a forum for dialogue on and monitoring about the food and nutrition security in the region. Currently, we cover 17 countries, so ranging from Mauritania to Chad, and 420 million inhabitants. The food and nutrition security domain is still, or topic is still very much present in our work. And you see a map on this on the slide that this has been produced last week at the Food Crisis Prevention Network meeting, and it gives an outlook for the food crisis situation, projected crisis situation June, August, where if nothing is being done, 27 million people might be in need of food assistance. So just as a reminder of the importance of this debate also in West Africa and the Sahel in particular. I thought I'm going to concentrate the presentation on what is actually different, or what are the characteristics in West Africa that sets it apart from the global debate on food systems. But before talking about the differences, I thought I'm going to start by saying what is similar. And similar is, it's the system, it's the challenges, and it's the complexity. So the food system is the same. You have the same drivers that are globally identified as impacting food system outcomes. You have the three challenges that Kuhn mentioned as well, the food and nutrition security, the livelihoods, and the environmental sustainability. And all this leads to this complexity that we are aware of, right? And this is also very much the same in Africa, but also in Africa broadly. What is different? We think what is different is the scale of the food systems in societies in West Africa, right? And I mentioned the food and nutrition crisis situation. So this is obviously something that is very present, but there's also the economic aspect. And we have estimated that the food economy, so everything that is spent on food, accounts for $260 billion per year in West Africa and the 17 countries alone. It's by far the largest economic sector, contributing to 40% of the regional GDP. And obviously, in terms of employment, it's even bigger. It's like almost 2/3 of the total employed population in the region works in food-related activities. And that, to understand this, it's not only agriculture, right? So even outside agriculture, you have 1 out of 3 possibilities to be employed in food-related activities, in food processing, food marketing, or street food, restaurants, food services, so to say. So also in urban areas, the food economy is a major employer. So this is the scale of the food systems in West Africa. A second feature that we think sets it very much apart is the pace of the transformations that are ongoing. And on this slide, you see the urban network changing since the 1950s until 2015. And this is obviously the urbanization dynamic is the most visible result of the demographics that are ongoing, right? And the urbanization changes profoundly the societies. It changes the political structure, it changes the economic structure, but also changes social structures in countries. And to understand what's happening is, for instance, in 1950, Kenya had as many urban agglomerations as the whole continent at that time. Or Abidjan today has more inhabitants than the whole country at independence in the 1960s. So this is incredibly fast-paced, and this drives massive transformations also in food systems. It's the diet transition in urban areas, but it reaches beyond that. It reaches to land prices. It affects like access to technologies, infrastructure, and all these things. And this trend, this fast-paced transformation is ongoing. So urbanization is going to continue for another 1 or 2 generations until we have like similar urbanizations level than in the rest of the world. And from a policy perspective, obviously there is like accompanying these transformations, these fast-paced transformations is complicated. And maybe something that I also want to highlight as a third difference between the more OECD context and the African context is the importance of data, facts, and evidence. So one is what we call the beyond averages. So we need data that goes beyond average, beyond national averages. Regions within countries are very much different as well. Urban and rural areas are different. So we need better data, but then there's also linked to the transformation I just mentioned is that we see things changing at the margins of the distribution, but if you average out the data, you don't see anything moving anymore. So there is a need to invest heavily in data generation capacities in Africa to be better able to understand what is happening. This also leads to this term of the quiet revolution and the hidden middle. So it's the quiet revolution has been termed by people at the Michigan State University of what is happening in the food value chain. And it's quiet because nobody's talking about it and how food value chains are transforming, how this 260 billion food economy is actually being structured, right? From the production side to the consumption side. You have the hidden middle. This intermediate, it's the million small and medium-sized enterprises that actually do the transactions between food production and food consumption, and there's almost no data on these people, and there's also therefore very little interest or focus and policy debates on the role of these actors. I mean, we saw something picking up with unfortunately with the COVID-19 crisis, also in OECD countries, where people understood, oh, to access food, we actually need to get the food into cities, right? Or we need migrant workers to pick fruits and vegetables. And this shows like this intermediary, the middle segment is crucially important as well. And then I added a slide on food price levels. So in West Africa, but this also holds for Sub-Saharan Africa, food prices at comparable income levels in Africa are higher than any other region of the world. So in one sense, you have a lot of people who are living on food activities, but at the same time, the population pays on average 30% more than in other regions of the world at comparable income level. So everything that impacts political decisions, trade-offs, synergies that you think have a much larger impact in African context, as we think is nicely captured by this graph. So my last slide is, but this has already been said by Kuhn, also designing or managing processes for better food system policies in Africa will also depend on data evidence, will also depend on generating and creating a shared understanding and on the inclusive and transparent policy dialogue. So I can stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip, for this. We are already quite back in time. So I want to introduce the panel and make it very quick. We start with Godfrey Bahigwa from the African Union Commission. Then we will listen to Martin Hoppe from the German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation. Wilhelm Olthoff will follow from the European Union Commission. Then we have Adiyinka Onabolu from Nigeria, Sanalisa Taivilama from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland, Dave Watson from the UK, Foreign Ministry, Commonwealth and Development Office, and Tom Arnold from Ireland. Quite a big group, very interesting panelists. Please, Godfrey, go ahead with your statement.
Thank you so much, Conrad. Happy to be here. And I want to appreciate the invitation extended to the African Union to make some remarks to today's discussion. I like very much the report. I have not read it in detail, but certainly the presentation by Con has helped to delve into some of the key aspects of the report, and I thank you for that presentation, and also appreciate the reflection by Philip, bringing in the African perspective from the West African region. Looking at the report, certainly while it is focused on the OECD, as Philip has mentioned, it does have lots of lessons and implications for what is taking place in Africa. I work with the African Union Commission, and the African Union is a member state organization with 55 countries, and as diverse as you can find. And so for us, when it comes to making or providing policy guidance to our member states, it's basically a coalition of the willing. The African Union is not a government. So what the member states agree on at heads of state level is not a directive to our member states to implement. It is advisory in nature. And so when it comes to agriculture, at the moment, what is driving the African agenda is what is commonly known as the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Program, in short, CAADP. And that was adopted by African heads of state and government in 2014 in Malabo, Equatorial Guinea. So that is what is driving the African Union agenda to transform agriculture in general, to transform food systems on the continent. And what is expected to happen at each member state level is for each country to take that continental policy framework and adopt it and adapt it to national level by developing compliant, what you could call compliant national agriculture investment plans that take into account the commitments within the Malabo Declaration. And so our role as African Union is to support the member countries through the regional economic communities to develop compliant national agriculture investment plans. That is role number one. Role number two of the African Union is then, once countries start implementing their national investment plans, is to track and report on the progress that they are making in the implementation of these programs towards the common goals and targets in the Malabo Declaration. And in 2014, the heads of state agreed that they would like to receive every 2 years a report on the progress that countries are making in the implementation of the CAADP agenda. And we have so far produced 2 reports. The first one, the inaugural report in 2017, and the second report in 2019, adopted by the member states January last year. And now we are in the process of developing the third report, which will be presented to the heads of state in January of 2022. So that is our second function as African Union in supporting the transformation agenda. Now, coming back to to comment specifically on the issue of making better policies for food systems. Definitely, like I said, the African Union is not a government. Implementation of policy intentions is left to the member states, and these are sovereign states. So each member state decides what they would like to do. But what we have learned from the 2 reports tracking the implementation of this common agriculture transformation framework is that the member states are not on track towards achieving the goals and targets that they set by to be achieved by 2025. So we do track, we have common indicators that measure their performance towards those common targets. I'll not get into that. But what we have learned is that they are not on track. Out of the 47 countries that reported in 2019, only 4 countries were on track towards achieving the Malabo goals and targets. And that is Rwanda, Morocco, Mali, and Ghana. But we also observed from our report that 36 countries made positive progress between 2017, the first report, and 2019 in the second report. So so they made positive progress, although they were not moving at a pace that would enable them to meet the CAADP goals and targets. Now, making my last initial remark with regard to the UN Food Systems Summit, we are asking more or less the same question, because the UN, especially with regard to SDG number 2, the world at large is not on track towards meeting the SDG targets in by 2030. So what do we need to do as a continent in order to transform food systems in Africa to be able to meet both the continental targets, but also the global targets in the SDGs? So we are asking exactly the same questions, at the moment, and working with the AU Development Agency, engaging with our countries through national dialogues to discuss what are the innovative ideas or solutions that we can propose that would help our countries to invest better, to transform food systems towards the UN Food System Summit. And finally, what we are working towards is developing a common position, an African common position that we shall take to the UN Food System Summit, bringing together the proposals of Africa as one, rather than having different views across the 55 member states. So with that, let me first stop here, and I would be happy to come back and respond to specific questions that the audience may have. Back to you, moderator. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Godfrey. Usman, are you able to take over? I see you on the screen. Yeah, I'm afraid he is listening, but I think maybe he cannot do it. Usman?
Hi, Conrad, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Wow, loud and clear.
Okay, I'm connecting from my phone, but I think you are doing a great moderation, and I would suggest that you continue the moderation. Thank you.
Okay, good, Usman, no problem. So we are very short in time. So the next speakers, please hurry up. So I call Mr. Hoppe from the Ministry of Cooperation, Federal Republic of Germany. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for your stand-up moderation. I think you're guiding us through this session perfectly. Allow me to try and be interactive, respond a little bit to the excellent presentations, by the way. Koen and Philip, thank you very much. I've had a chance to look into the slides beforehand, and I like the one best that was saying achieving better policies is made difficult by disagreement over facts, interests, and values. As much as we talk about the complexities, there are certain aspects to it, and I would like to address these in the context of the Food System Summit and maybe show some ways forward. So what we understand, and I think Godfrey also mentioned that in his presentations, there are countries making very good progress, but some not so much. So I would argue one very important step would be just to make food systems and properly feeding their population a real politics priority. I think that's number one. For a long time, and we've seen this in development cooperation, agriculture has been rather neglected. It's been non-sexy, but actually it is a matter of life and death. So it should be more prominent and on the top of policy priorities. That's one. Secondly, I believe the Food Systems Summit really gave us an excellent opportunity to address exactly these three elements that you were mentioning are the constraints or the bottlenecks towards better policies. One is facts. I think the Food Systems Summit has created a lot of dynamics when it comes to gathering and presenting the facts and wanting to be organizations that gather facts. I've seen quite some trends there. FAO has really got to push from this. The scientific group has done excellent work, and I would really hope this the stimulus that the Food System Summit gave can carry on. So we should think of the Food System Summit not as a one-time and off event, but also in this regard, what has it taught us, and what should we learn when it comes to administrating the joint scientific research and facts gathering? How should we organize this better? I feel there's so many facts are there. The presentation you gave, Kun, is a treasure, but I believe access to such information and that it be made use of is a bottleneck. And then comes interest. So coming together, the coming together of interest, and Philip, there was the same in your presentation. I'm very happy about the setup of the action tracks, actually, of the Food System Summit, where various actors from the most different groups have joined and discussed in the action tracks of the Food System Summit and have actually produced more than 1,200 recommendations. So I would also agree, and I don't want to dwell on this so long, that bringing together interests is actually not so hard to do. The work in the action tracks showed this. If people really focus on certain problems, even they come from a very different background, they can come to joint recommendations and solutions. But the problem really lies, and I would totally agree, when it comes to bringing on one page the values. This is really problematic, and that's why I so strongly believe the food systems dialogues are so relevant, so important. That is why Germany made a big financial contribution actually to the Food Systems Summit and earmarked it for enabling these food systems dialogues in the least developed countries. I would really hope and encourage to have these dialogues in each and every state and nation. This is what you called the deliberative process. This has the potential to really bring together and do away with some of the differences in value, but come together on a joint mission for each and every country, but also for the global food systems. So I really hope these food systems dialogues can also continue after the Food Systems Summit. They can actually be, to my understanding, the lessons learned that we need these dialogues to continue and bring together the actors. We would be very happy to see this as one of the outcomes and follow-ups of the Food Systems Summit. And one last point about the complexities. Yes, Food System Summit, and I love this slide with the guy like being a little bit clueless, seeing this chart. I think we should move away from thinking governments can solve it all. Such a complex issue like achieving sustainable food systems, it's almost as complex because it touches on almost any SDG, frankly. It's almost as complex as achieving the SDG agenda altogether. So we really need to involve various actors, give them a role, and accept also for governments, I'm speaking on behalf of government, that we don't have, not one actor has all the solutions. We should be modest and we should be clear about about the role each of the actors has to play, and also be be willing to accept someone else has a more important or very important contribution to make, also as a government. This will be my short remarks on this excellent, very excellent report and presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hoppe. I move on directly to Willem Uithoff from the European Commission, from the Directorate General of International Partnerships, where he is the deputy head of the unit for sustainable agri-food systems and fisheries. Over to you, Willem. Thank you for joining.
And thank you, Conrad, for moderating and stepping in so skillfully. Many thanks to Koen and Philip for the presentations at the beginning. I thought they were extremely well done, and they lead to lots of points to react to or to consider. In the interest of time, I will not do that. I will also not deal with the Food Systems Summit, but I will highlight 3 points. The first is a bit of a reaction to the presentations. And one of the points that I noticed is that out of the, let's say, dimensions of the food systems, the dimension of livelihoods was skipped a bit. There was not that much attention to what it means to be in the different sides of the food systems, and particularly on the agricultural side, particularly to be a small-scale farmer. And I think that part might need a little bit of more rigor in order to appreciate also the other dimensions. And one of the dimensions that I would think it deserves particular attention is the biodiversity dimension. When we talk particularly around agriculture, the biodiversity dimension is important. It's not just a matter of trends here, it's a matter of irreversible losses. And that's a crisis. And of course, there is a summit this year again and again. But it is this is one of the crucial years to link up the agriculture and the biodiversity sites. Now, what does this report and what does the messaging around food systems add? I think the big gain that we're having of all this attention to food systems is this change of mindset, a change and the opportunity for a change of mindset, a mindset that is much more integrated, much more holistic than before. It is now nearly a year ago that the European Commission launched the Farm to Fork strategy. And I was privy to looking a little bit at the cooking of this strategy. I was not allowed to be in the kitchen, but I could watch through the window, and let's say the dynamics were very interesting. In the past, everything that had to do with food was basically driven by the agricultural side and a little bit by the fisheries side. But here the European Commission changed things around and said, okay, now we're no longer putting the pen and the power in the hands of the agriculturalists. Let's do it, and these were our colleagues from the DG Sante, so this is food safety, it's about health and etc. So it was not the environmental side, it was not the production side, but more from the consumer point of view. This is, of course, also a choice, but it was a different choice, and you look at things and problems from a different perspective. So one of the points that comes out of it is that now we have much more integrated discussions within the Commission. We have much more, we've got regular interactions, both inside and outside the EU effect, but on all aspects of the food system, rather than the silos that we had in the past. There is no way that we break all the silos immediately, because some of them are very persistent, but there is a change of mindset happening. And I think that is the big gain of food systems. Might also be the big gain of the Food Systems Summit. I end with 3 remarks on what kind of implications we took out of this farm to fork strategy and in this more integrated thinking on our development cooperation. The first is that we think it helps indeed to invest in data and analysis. And one of the things that we've been doing the last couple of months is with the FAO, with the CIRAD and others, to develop a methodology for food systems assessment and to conduct that in a number of partner countries, which helps both in the Food Systems Summit deliberations, but also in analyzing in a more in a more integrated way what the challenges are, and bringing people together, because it's also talking about it. It's not just analysis, it's also bringing people to understand the various challenges and directions. Second is, we've given guidance in our, let's say, in the preparation of our support for the next couple of years for more integrated approaches. Again, that bumps into lots of difficulties, but we think it's the right way. More integrated between agriculture, water, energy, and more landscape type of approaches. Also investigating more in what you can do around agroecology, etc. So that is it's one of the directions we would like to take. And the third point is that you talk a lot about synergies and trade-offs. I think what we would try to do is to find particularly those points that lead to synergies. And I think we can support creating synergies actively. That depends as well on your investments, on science, on innovation, what type of research will be done through the CGIAR, for instance. That is a direction that we also like to take. It sounds a bit vague and general, but I think it is an important element of the mindset, which brings me back to the first point that I had and where I want to stop here. So back to you, Conrad.
Yeah, thank you, Willem, for your very clear points. I really appreciated them very much. And some critical points at the beginning as well, you know, the small scale farmers, we don't have to forget them. Huh? This is maybe not the focus of OECD, but that's our task to not to forget them. Okay, maybe our next speaker, Adeyinka Onabolu, can also tell us about this. She comes from Nigeria, so an African voice. Adeyinka, you present a little bit yourself, and I just hand over to you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Adeyinka Onabolu. I'm the senior advisor to the Minister of Agriculture on food security and nutrition. I'm glad to be here. Thanks so much, Quen and Philip, for your presentations. And thank you also, Willem, for pointing out those aspects that the report did not touch on. And straight away, I want to add another aspect, which is very key for Nigeria and maybe the African continent as a whole. And that is the issue of resilience of the food systems. Because right now in Nigeria, we have a lot of challenges with shocks, with insecurity. People are not able to go about their farming businesses and even their small food processing businesses. And the other thing I would like to add here in response to the presentation is that, yes, for the OECD countries, food production is keeping pace with population growth, but the same cannot be said for Nigeria, especially because population growth is higher than food production. So we end up importing food. We end up importing what others do not want. We have a lot of food safety challenges. And all these are things that stakeholders have been able to bring to the fore as we've been having the dialogues towards our participation in the UN Food Systems Summit. I must say that the Food Systems Summit, the preparation, has been a very good opportunity for us to discuss issues around the food systems, because before now, in Nigeria, it's been around food security, which has actually made it impossible for the agricultural sector to focus on providing adequate diets and the rest, because it's been productivity geared at certain commodities, geared at exports and the rest. And you all know that we're also not doing well in the area of food exports because of challenges of safety, residual chemicals, and the rest. I also want to say here that in the course of these, that maybe I should step back a bit to say that the concept of food systems is very recent in Nigeria. At least before 2017, we were not talking about food systems approach to all these issues. When we came up with the agricultural sector food security and nutrition strategy, that was when we started looking at, okay, the food systems approach may be a better way to work towards improving the nutrition indices in Nigeria, and also to address the issues of hunger. Because according to estimates, and also according to the national surveys that we've been carrying out, we know that the diverse and healthy diets are not affordable for low-income consumers. And from that analysis, it was arrived at that 91% of our population cannot afford a healthy diet. I already mentioned the issue around food safety, and the issues around that is that it is the vulnerable populations that are more vulnerable to these foodborne diseases or food safety related diseases. And I also like the fact that it was mentioned that we should not forget the smallholder farmers, because in Nigeria, 88% of those who produce food are smallholder farmers. And most of them farm on land areas that are about 0.5 hectares. And coupled with that is the fact that because they're poor, they don't have access to productive inputs. And even when those inputs eventually come, they come when the planting season is almost ended. And I also think one of the biggest challenges we have is our reliance on rain-fed agriculture. So during all these dialogues, the people from farmers to farmer groups and processing groups and policymakers, at least now they are able to sit at the same table with people who are affected to listen to how they think those challenges can be addressed. And I don't want to mention the things that have already been said, but I like to say that thinking about new policies and maybe modification of old policies, yes, we know that it's not easy to come to the table and have a policy that works for everyone. But if we must make our food systems work for everybody, deliver healthy diets, provide jobs and support livelihoods, then any policy that we are thinking of has to combine issues around agricultural productions, markets and trade systems, consumer purchasing power, and food transformation and consumer demand. Yes, in developed countries, issues around sugar taxes and all the rest work. But with us, we have not come to that level because it is the big corporations that pay the tax and the government is able to use their money. So how do you fight the person that brings the money for you to be able to run your affairs? And yes, please. So I'm going to stop now. I'm actually going to stop because that was the last comment I wanted to make, that policies must have those 4 things at the core of it. Thank you very much for listening.
I think really great. I I love your comments. It's so good to listen to you. I could listen for hours, you know, because it comes really from the bottom of your heart, and I think very inspiring. Unfortunately, we are really we will not have any time for a public debate. If you want still to listen to our last panelists, nobody really skipped our invitation. So next panelist is Sanna-Liisa Tavilama from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from Finland. Sanna-Liisa, are you with us?
Yes,
Yeah,
I'm there.
go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I will be very brief, like as Finnish are always. So first, I just want to thank you for the Cohen and other authors of the report. I think it's really excellent, and especially when it's result oriented and focuses how the issues could be resolved. I especially appreciate that the values are included. I think that the role of the values is increasing as people are getting more and more interested on food and its origin, and everything related to it. As you see that you must have noticed that the consumer groups are more and more active, and they are also getting involved in broader aspects and broader range of the issues in food systems. And I agree with Martin that the Food Systems Summit dialogues is a great opportunity to hear also the consumers and everybody who is involved in food, which means that all of us. So I don't go now through the policy issues and what kind of policies we should look at more, but maybe in the report and when we are talking about policies, we should more take into account the other drivers of the food system, like poor governance, demographic and employment development, inequality, and all those things that are making the whole system very complex. So now I think that it's a huge momentum, a huge opportunity to discuss about food systems. Our expectation for the food system summits are very high, and I hope that the discussions and results of the summit will be concrete, and also they will be implemented and not to stay on declaration level. So I hope that we can say goodbye for the silos and silos of the sectoral policies and lack of the policy coherence, and go look at the future and act in the future in a more coherent manner. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Sanna-Liisa, for your brief comments. I hand over directly to Dave Watson, UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. I hope you are still with us. Didn't lose your patience. Dave? No. Okay. Dave, once more, are you with us? We cannot hear you. Yeah, now I see you, and maybe I can also hear you. No.
Conrad, this is Usman.
Yeah, Usman. Yes.
Yes, Dave has a connection problem like me, so I think he was not able to join.
Okay, good. So we skip him. I see him. Maybe he can listen to us. So greetings to Dave. Thank you for joining. Unfortunately, we cannot hear you. I move on to our last panelist, Tom Arnold from Ireland. We had a brief talk at the beginning. Ireland has already made an interesting exercise of dialogues and joining forces. I'm very curious to listen to your experience and your reflections on what OECD is proposing. Over to you, Tom. You're muted.
Sorry, I'm delighted to be involved in a session with two institutions, the OECD and GIZ, for whom I have the greatest admiration. I'd like to go to maybe to talk about the practical aspects of developing a food strategy, using a food systems approach, because that's what we have just done in Ireland, and we hope that we plan the outcome of that, the launch of that document for public consultation will take place later today. First, though, a reflection. I mean, a reflection which was captured by a couple of the comments earlier. It's very recent, in very recent years, we've begun to talk about food systems. I mean, up to now, if we were talking about agri-food strategies, it was largely ministries of agriculture planning for either expansion of output or looking after farm incomes. So when we move then to talking about food systems, we're necessarily broadening the debate. And the question then is, how broad does that new framework need to be? Koen put up a slide which showed food systems in their full complexity. I think if you're planning to do planning on a food systems basis, you have to begin to think about where the boundaries are introduced, what levels of complexity you're willing to go to. And I think in the current moment, it is reasonable to say that you should restrict those levels of additional complexity to link with environment and to link with health. They seem to me to be the three broad topics that you will begin to focus on. And then, of course, you have to make decisions about what aspects of this. You can't deal with the whole range of things. And if you begin to look at it through the framework of trying to identify those areas of food, environment, and health, where there are possibly synergies, that seems to me to be the beginnings of a planning framework. After that, you have to be very clear about where you're starting from, in whether you're talking about the country you're dealing with or a region. What example, if you're talking about a more consultative process, what's the tradition of consultation processes in a country or a region? Because that's going to limit or determine, how you're going to put such a process together. The other aspect is, what tradition is there of different ministries talking to each other? In Ireland, when we started our process, I said to agriculture, look, we obviously have to talk to the Department of Health to discover that this was not a common occurrence. And so when we had the beginnings of those discussions, we had to begin, if you like, from the beginning. So these are some of the, I think, really important things that you have to do at the beginning. The other thing is that I think is very important is develop a set of clear terms of reference for the group. I mean, that is also will determine how you're going to minimize the complexity and spend the time that you need to get that clarity at the beginning, because it's going to save you time later on. The other thing which I think is important is that if you set up a group, you have to decide on the level of representativeness it is. But having done that, then I think it's very important that you set the ground rules at the beginning as to how that group is going to work. And after that, you proceed. I think another important factor is that you need to have, I think, a strong secretariat support to deal with the drafting to enable the group to function most effectively, because you cannot expect a consultative group to do the drafting. So they are just some of the basic approaches to developing a strategy based on food systems principles, which I think are important. And I'll stop there, Conrad, because I'm very conscious of time.
Okay, thank you very much, Arnold. Yeah, really for your practical aspects. I hope we can dig into this in a later opportunity. I have the impression that maybe this is just the start of more debate, you know. Unfortunately, I think I have to steal you 5 minutes of your lunchtime. You know, the food is waiting, but we still have to make two things. One is our OECD colleagues want to know your impressions from this webinar. So there will be a little questionnaire popping up. You can also, I think, answer to it later when we finish here, but please dedicate a few minutes to it. And then I have the pleasure to ask Mark Nolting from GIZ to give a few summary remarks, you know, a little wrap up. And you know, when he finishes, I say thanks again, but my role is coming to an end now. Mark, you're
Yes.
wrap
Yeah.
up.
Thank you very much, Konrad. Dear colleagues, I'm stepping in now for Crystal Bella Molongwa, the head of division for rural development and agriculture. Due to some unforeseen urgent matters, she can unfortunately not join our meeting. So this hits me somehow unprepared, but I took notes of this very interesting discussion. And let me start by thanking all of you for your active participation, our colleagues from the OECD, but also our panelists. I think this has been an extremely helpful event with a very valuable input from our OECD colleagues, Leanne, Koen, and Philip. And thank you again for your reflections for the presentation of this report. I think we have gained through your presentation a very good understanding of the food systems approach, its challenges that we are currently facing, particularly at the international level, but also in the various countries. I took a few notes, or let's call them a few takeaways that I just want to present here. I'm sure you have your own takeaways and you may disagree probably with some, but hopefully it mirrors what we have discussed today. I think one point that has been mentioned clearly is that negotiation processes are needed to transform food systems into more sustainable and more resilient systems. This is not an easy task, as we all know from our own experiences at the European level or in the European context, and to include all relevant stakeholders, private sector, smallholders, business policy decision makers, is extremely challenging. So we need an exclusive approach. And as my friend Godfrey from the AUC pointed out, a coalition of the willing is key. Godfrey also pointed out that if we look at the African continent, there are established frameworks that can be used actually to carry forward a food systems approach. And here the CAADP framework is an extremely important instrument and solid basis for further developing food systems. Another point that was mentioned is that food systems should become a policy priority. This was a clear statement made by Martin from BMZ. And I like the statements, Martin Hoppe, that it is indeed no longer a matter of discussing different choices. It is rather a question of life or death. So this is a very dramatic statements, but I think we exactly need those statements in the further discussion, provided that they are underpinned by data, evidence, and figures that we can use as further arguments. And Martin pointed also out that it is no longer the role of governments only to achieve the SDG agenda, and that we need to involve various actors and give them a role. Wilhelm from the European Commission mentioned that the big gain in the whole food systems discussion is a change of mindsets. And here I fully agree. This has been pointed out by him. He said, or mentioned that the opportunity for change of mindset towards a more holistic approach has also been reflected in the farm to fork strategy of the European Union and the European Commission. Wilhelm also pointed out that there is a need for evidence and the need for analyzing in a more integrated way and by using data. And I think here the OECD report that we just discussed is a very solid and important piece of work and an important piece of information, particularly when it comes to data and evidence. From Nigeria, from Adin, sorry if I pronounce your name. So making food systems more resilient towards shocks, crises, disasters is key. She also pointed out that the concept of food systems is still very recent in Nigeria, and I think this is true for other African countries also, and that in the discussion of food systems, it needs to be considered also that we cannot just discuss holistic approaches or new policies. We also need into consideration very specific issues, like, for example, challenges that Nigeria is facing with regards to its dependence on rain-fed agriculture. Sana-Liisa from Finland mentioned also that there are, of course, other important drivers for the food systems governance, including demographics, that we need to take into consideration. And I fully agree with her saying that our expectation from the Food Systems Summit is that we should not, or that the Food Systems Summit should not just deliver very general statements or recommendations, but rather very concrete approaches, solutions, and joint actions, or at least plans how to carry those issues forward in a coherent and consolidated joint matter. Tom, Arnold challenged, I think, us and the food systems approach a bit, and in a very smart way, by saying that there is a need to restrict also levels of complexity, and that there are certain boundaries of the food systems approach that we need to take into consideration, because what we should avoid is that it becomes too complex, too holistic, and that then at the end of the day, it is no longer specific enough to be really implemented. I think Tom mentioned that particularly the connection to health and biodiversity should or is extremely important and need to be considered in the further discussion. And that a clear set of terms of references for any core group involved in the food systems approach is key. So these, in a nutshell, would be my takeaways. I think the complexity just of those few notes I took show that it is a very complex approach, but I think we did a very great job, and particularly our OECD colleagues, to present the report. And then I would like to thank again all our panelists, Godfrey Bahigwa, Martin Hoppe, Wilhelm Oldorf, Adinyaka Onabulu, Sana-Liisa, Dave Watson, who could not, Dave he could not connect, but Tom also for their valuable inputs and comments. And last but not least, I would like to thank the organizing team, Helia and Eddie from the OECD side, Lieselotte and Konrad from GIZ, and last but not least, Usman, the head of our agriculture policy program. So thank you very much, and sorry for closing not on time, but I think it was worth to invest another 8 to 10 minutes into this good discussion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, once again, thank you from my side, and maybe also thank you to the patient audience. We had 66, in the maximum 66 listeners. We still have 53, so this is a good sign that the topics were really thriving. And I really apologize that you didn't get a voice this time. We had a little bit technical difficulties, but we also had very interesting presentations. So for sure, we will think of how to engage further on with you and get you on board in the next opportunity. Thank you very much from my side, and have a good personal food system now with your lunch.